You know what's wild? Before the MCU turned superhero movies into the biggest thing since sliced bread, there was this leather-clad vampire hunter who basically kicked down the door for everything that came after. We're talking about Blade, the 1998 film that proved comic book movies could be dark, bloody, and absolutely badass. So let's dive deep into this groundbreaking flick that changed the game forever. The whole premise of Blade is pretty straightforward but incredibly cool. We've got a world where vampires exist in secret, living among humans like parasites, feeding on them while staying hidden in plain sight. These aren't your sparkly romantic vampires either. These are straight-up monsters who see humans as nothing more than cattle. The vampire population has its own society, complete with hierarchy, rules, and ancient traditions. They've infiltrated every level of human society, from street level all the way up to positions of power and influence. It's a secret war that's been going on for centuries, and humanity doesn't even know they're fighting it. Enter our protagonist, a half-vampire, half-human hybrid who's made it his life's mission to hunt these creatures down and protect the human race from the shadows. The movie opens with one of the most iconic scenes in superhero cinema, a blood rave where vampires party while literal sprinklers spray blood from the ceiling. It's in your face, it's shocking, and it immediately tells you this isn't your typical comic book adaptation. The main character, of course, is Blade himself, played with absolute perfection by Wesley Snipes. Blade, whose real name is Eric Brooks, is what's called a Daywalker, a vampire who has all their strengths but none of their weaknesses, except for the bloodthirst. He was born after his mother was bitten by a vampire while she was pregnant with him, which resulted in this unique hybrid condition. Blades spent his entire life training to be the perfect vampire killer, mastering martial arts, weapons, and tactics specifically designed to take down the undead. He's cold, he's ruthless, and he's driven by a very personal vendetta against the creatures that destroyed his life before it even began. Wesley Snipes brings this incredible intensity to the role, combining physical prowess with emotional depth. You can see the pain behind those dark sunglasses, the constant struggle between his human side and his vampire nature. Blade isn't your typical hero who cracks jokes and makes friends easily. He's a warrior monk dedicated to a single purpose, and that singular focus makes him absolutely terrifying to his enemies. The character exists in this moral gray area that was pretty unusual for superhero movies at the time, willing to do whatever it takes to complete his mission. Supporting Blade is Abraham Whistler, played brilliantly by Kris Kristofferson. Whistler is basically Blade's mentor, father figure, and weaponsmith all rolled into one grizzled package. He found Blade when he was just a kid and trained him to be the ultimate vampire hunter. Whistler's got his own tragic backstory. Vampires killed his family, which set him on this path of revenge that's consumed his entire adult life. He's the one who developed the serum that keeps Blade's vampire thirst under control, essentially acting as both his technical support and his moral compass. The relationship between Blade and Whistler is one of the emotional cores of the film, showing a deep bond built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine affection. Kristofferson plays Whistler with this perfect blend of tough guy, mentor, and caring father, bringing warmth to scenes that could otherwise be entirely about violence and revenge. He's also got some of the best lines in the movie, delivering vampire hunting wisdom with that trademark gravelly voice. Whistler represents the human element in Blade's life, the connection that keeps him from losing himself entirely to the monster within. Then we've got Dr. Karen Jensen, played by N'Bushe Wright, who serves as the audience surrogate character. She's a hematologist who gets bitten by a vampire during an emergency room incident and suddenly finds herself pulled into this hidden world she never knew existed. Karen represents the normal human perspective, asking all the questions the audience would ask if they suddenly discovered vampires were real. She's not just a damsel in distress, though. She's intelligent, capable, and actually contributes to the mission by using her medical knowledge to help understand vampire physiology and potentially develop new weapons against them. Her growing relationship with Blade helps to humanize him, showing us glimpses of the man beneath the vampire hunter exterior. Karen sees the good in Blade that he often can't see in himself, and she becomes a crucial part of the team despite her initial terror. Wright brings a genuine quality to the role, making Karen feel like a real person thrown into extraordinary circumstances rather than just a plot device. Her character arc from terrified victim to active participant in the vampire war gives the film an additional layer of storytelling beyond just the action sequences. On the villain side, we have Deacon Frost, portrayed by Stephen Dorff in a performance that's equal parts charismatic and menacing. Frost is a relatively young vampire by their standards, and he's got serious ambitions that put him at odds with the vampire establishment. He's not content with the old ways of hiding in the shadows and carefully managing the human population. He wants vampires to rule openly, to take their place as the dominant species on the planet. Frost is intelligent, manipulative, and absolutely ruthless in pursuing his goals. He's got this rock star quality to him, dressing in modern clothes and embracing contemporary culture in a way that the older, more traditional vampires find distasteful. Stephen Dorff plays him with this cocky swagger that makes him both hateable and weirdly compelling. Frost isn't just evil for evil's sake. He genuinely believes in his vision of vampire supremacy and sees himself as a revolutionary rather than a villain. His youth and ambition make him dangerous in ways the ancient vampires aren't, because he's willing to break all the rules and take enormous risks to achieve his objectives. The dynamic between Frost and Blade is particularly interesting because they're actually similar in many ways. Both are outcasts from the societies they belong to. Both are trying to change the world. They're just on opposite sides of the moral spectrum. The vampire world in Blade has this really interesting hierarchy and political structure. At the top, you've got the pure-blood vampires, those who were born as vampires rather than being turned. These purebloods look down on turned vampires, considering them inferior despite the fact that they share the same powers and weaknesses. The purebloods follow something called the Shadow Council, a group of ancient vampire elders who make the rules and try to maintain the status quo of vampires secretly coexisting with humans. These guys wear expensive suits, live in penthouses, and treat the whole vampire thing like a business enterprise. They're led by Dragonetti, played by Udo Kier, who represents the old guard that Frost is rebelling against. The turned vampires, meanwhile, are treated almost like second-class citizens in vampire society, which creates this whole class conflict that Frost exploits for his own purposes. The movie does a great job of building out this vampire culture with its own rules, traditions, and internal politics, making it feel like a fully realized world rather than just a generic monster threat. You get the sense that this society has existed for thousands of years, developing its own customs and power structures completely separate from human civilization. Frost's gang includes several notable vampires who serve as his inner circle and primary enforcers. There's Quinn, played by Donald Logue, who's basically Frost's right-hand man and muscle. Quinn's a brawler, a vampire who loves the violence and chaos that comes with their lifestyle. He's the first vampire we see Blade fight in the movie during that iconic blood rave scene, and he keeps coming back throughout the film despite being burned, staked, and otherwise destroyed multiple times. Then there's Mercury, a vampire woman who serves as one of Frost's lieutenants and seems to share his bed as well as his ambitions. Raquel, another female vampire, rounds out the core group. These characters aren't deeply developed individually, but they serve their purpose as obstacles for Blade to overcome and demonstrations of Frost's growing power and influence. The movie shows Frost building an army, recruiting younger vampires who are dissatisfied with the traditional vampire hierarchy, and promising them a world where they don't have to hide anymore. His crew has this gang-like quality to them, more street-level and modern than the aristocratic purebloods, which fits perfectly with Frost's revolutionary rhetoric about overthrowing the old order. The plot really kicks into high gear when Frost starts pursuing an ancient vampire prophecy about La Magra, a blood god that supposedly represents the essence of vampire power. According to the old texts, there's a ritual that can awaken this entity and give the summoner incredible power, basically turning them into an invincible vampire god. The catch is that the ritual requires very specific conditions, including the blood of the Daywalker, which means Frost needs Blade to complete his plan. This is where the movie's main conflict crystallizes. Frost needs to capture Blade to perform the ritual, while Blade is trying to stop Frost before he can unleash this apocalyptic threat. The La Magra prophecy adds this mythological element to the film that elevates it beyond just a vampire hunting story. It taps into ancient lore and gives the stakes real weight. We're not just talking about Frost becoming more powerful, we're talking about him potentially becoming an unstoppable god who could enslave or destroy all of humanity. The prophecy also ties into Blade's unique nature, making him not just a hunter, but a key piece in this cosmic vampire chess game. One of the film's most memorable sequences is the archive scene, where Blade and Karen infiltrate a vampire records facility to learn more about Frost's plans. The archive is this library maintained by Pearl, a morbidly obese vampire who's been banned from feeding on humans and instead gorges on animal blood while cataloging vampire history. Pearl is played by Eric Edwards in heavy prosthetics, creating this grotesque but oddly pitiful character who's obsessed with computers and technology despite being a centuries-old vampire. The scene provides crucial exposition about the La Magra prophecy while also showing Blade's interrogation methods, which involve a lot of implied violence and the threat of burning Pearl alive. It's a darkly comic sequence that breaks up the action while moving the plot forward, and Pearl's character is a great example of how the film finds these weird little corners of vampire society to explore. The archive itself looks like a combination of ancient library and modern computer lab, symbolizing how these creatures have adapted to exist across centuries while keeping their secrets hidden from human discovery. The action sequences in Blade are absolutely phenomenal, especially considering this was 1998 and the technology available at the time. Director Stephen Norrington and the stunt team created fight scenes that blend martial arts, gunplay, and sword fighting into this unique combat style that became Blade's signature. Wesley Snipes did many of his own stunts, and his martial arts background really shows in the fluidity and power of the fight choreography. Every confrontation feels dangerous and impactful, with real weight behind the punches and real consequences to the violence. The movie doesn't shy away from the brutality of Blade's mission. Vampires explode into ash when they're killed, sure, but there's also blood, dismemberment, and genuine horror in many of the fight scenes. The opening blood rave battle sets the tone perfectly, with Blade cutting through vampires while techno music pounds and strobe lights flash. Later fights, like the confrontation in the vampire nightclub or the final battle against Frost, each have their own distinct flavor and style. The film also showcases Blade's arsenal of specialized weapons: silver stakes, EDTA-filled hollow-point bullets, silver boomerangs, UV flash bombs, and, of course, his iconic sword. Each weapon is designed specifically to kill or incapacitate vampires, showing the thought and preparation that goes into his hunting. Visually, Blade has this really distinctive style that set it apart from other action movies of its era. Cinematographer Theo van der Sande created this dark, saturated look with deep shadows and splashes of vibrant color, particularly reds and blues. The vampire world is shown as existing primarily at night and in underground spaces. Nightclubs, subway stations, warehouses, and hidden lairs. Everything has this gritty, urban texture that makes the fantastical elements feel grounded in a recognizable reality. The movie was shot primarily in Los Angeles, but the locations are used to create this timeless, placeless feeling where you're not quite sure exactly what city you're in or even what era. There are modern elements like computers and contemporary music, but also these Gothic architectural touches and old-world vampire aesthetics that create this cool blend of ancient and modern. The lighting design is particularly effective at creating atmosphere. Lots of practical lights, neon signs, and flames that give each scene a distinct mood. When Blade enters a space, there's often this play between light and shadow that visually represents his nature as something between human and vampire, between the daylight world and the darkness. The special effects in Blade hold up remarkably well for a film that's over 2 decades old now. The vampire death scenes, where they burst into flames and crumble to ash, were achieved through a combination of practical effects and early CGI, and they still look pretty satisfying. The practical makeup effects are particularly impressive. The vampire faces, when they reveal their true nature with the extended fangs and changed eyes, are genuinely creepy and sell the transformation from human-looking to monstrous. Stan Winston's studio handled the makeup effects, and you can see that quality craftsmanship in every vampire transformation. The film uses a lot of practical blood effects, which gives the violence a visceral quality that pure CGI often lacks. There are some dated CGI moments, particularly in the final La Magra sequence where Frost transforms into the blood god, but even those have a certain charm and don't really detract from the overall experience. The practical effects work, the stunts, and the fight choreography do most of the heavy lifting in terms of creating spectacle, with the digital effects serving as enhancement rather than replacement. Music plays a huge role in establishing Blade's tone and energy. Composer Mark Isham created this electronic industrial influence score that perfectly captures the dark, modern atmosphere of the vampire underworld. The soundtrack also features a bunch of electronic and hip-hop tracks from artists like New Order, Massive Attack, and Confusion, giving the film this contemporary, edgy vibe. The opening blood rave scene features Confusion by New Order, remixed by Pump Panel, and that track is now forever associated with that iconic sequence. The music helps bridge the gap between horror movie and action film, between gothic vampire aesthetic and modern urban thriller. It gives Blade its own unique sonic identity that's distinct from other superhero movies of the era. The score knows when to be atmospheric and moody and when to pump up the energy for action sequences, and it never overwhelms the scenes, but instead enhances them. The sound design overall is really effective, with distinctive sounds for each of Blade's weapons and satisfying audio cues for vampire deaths and impacts during fights. Stephen Norrington's direction brings all these elements together into a coherent, stylish whole. Norrington came from a visual effects background, and you can see that influence in how carefully composed and visually striking many of the shots are. He's not afraid to let the camera move, using sweeping shots and dynamic angles to add energy to the action sequences, while also creating these beautiful, almost painterly compositions in quieter moments. The pacing is pretty brisk. The movie runs about 2 hours, but it rarely feels slow, moving from action beat to character moment to plot revelation with efficiency. Norrington also deserves credit for the film's tone, which manages to be serious and dark without becoming overly grim or losing its sense of fun. There's this underlying coolness factor to everything that makes Blade feel like the most badass character in any room he enters. And that comes from directorial choices as much as from Wesley Snipes' performance. The film has moments of horror, moments of action, moments of humor, and even moments of genuine emotion, and Norrington navigates between these different modes smoothly. The screenplay by David S. Goyer is tight and efficient, wasting very little time on unnecessary subplots or filler. Goyer, who would go on to write for the Dark Knight trilogy and numerous other superhero projects, demonstrates here his ability to take comic book concepts and make them work in a cinematic context. The dialogue is often quotable without being overly quippy. Lines like, "Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill," have become iconic precisely because they feel natural to the character delivering them rather than feeling like screenwriters showing off. The script does a good job of establishing the rules of this vampire world clearly enough that the audience understands what's at stake without getting bogged down in excessive exposition. Information about vampire physiology, the social hierarchy, and the historical context is delivered through action and character moments, rather than through long explanatory speeches. Goyer also smartly keeps the focus on Blade's perspective, using Karen as the audience surrogate for learning about this world, but never losing sight of the fact that this is Blade's story. The structure follows a pretty classic action movie template, but the vampire mythology and the character work elevated above generic action fare. Blade's character arc is subtle, but definitely present throughout the film. At the beginning, he's completely closed off emotionally, seeing himself as nothing more than a weapon to be used against vampires. He's accepted that he's a monster, just one pointed at other monsters, and he's isolated himself from any kind of human connection beyond his functional relationship with Whistler. Karen's entry into his life challenges this self-perception, forcing him to engage with someone who sees him as a person rather than just a killer. When Whistler is captured and turned into a vampire by Frost, Blade is faced with the possibility of losing the only person in the world he's allowed himself to care about, which forces him to confront his emotions rather than burying them behind the mission. The revelation of his mother's fate, that she's still alive as a vampire and has been working with Frost, is another emotional gut punch that Blade has to process while fighting for his life. By the end of the film, Blade accepts both sides of his nature more fully and seems to open himself up to the possibility of working with others, as evidenced by his decision to save Karen rather than pursue Frost immediately. It's not a dramatic transformation, but there's definitely growth in how Blade sees himself and his place in the world. The relationship between Blade and his mother Vanessa is one of the film's most tragic elements. Vanessa, played by Sanaa Lathan, appears early in the movie during a flashback to Blade's birth, where we see her being attacked by Deacon Frost while in labor. Blade has believed his mother died that night, which has fueled his hatred of vampires for his entire life. The revelation that she actually survived as a vampire and has been living in the vampire world all this time is devastating for Blade on multiple levels. First, it means his primary motivation, avenging his mother, has been based on a false assumption. Second, it means his mother chose to remain a vampire rather than seek him out or try to reconnect with her son. When Frost uses Vanessa to seduce and distract Blade, it's this deeply twisted manipulation of the maternal relationship, turning what should be a joyful reunion into a weapon against him. The scene where vampire Vanessa tries to seduce Blade is genuinely disturbing, crossing all kinds of psychological and emotional boundaries. When Blade is finally forced to kill her to escape, it's a moment of real tragedy. He's literally destroying the person he spent his whole life trying to avenge and having to accept that she's been gone in any meaningful sense since that night in the hospital. The torture sequence where Frost has Blade captured and strung up is intense and shows our hero at his most vulnerable. Frost needs Blade's blood for the La Magra ritual, but he also takes sadistic pleasure in breaking down the Daywalker psychologically as well as physically. This is where Frost reveals that he was the vampire who attacked Blade's mother, making their conflict deeply personal rather than just ideological. Frost drains Blade's blood while taunting him about his hybrid nature, about being rejected by both humans and vampires, about being a freak who doesn't belong anywhere. It's during this sequence that we really see Blade's determination and strength of will, even while being exsanguinated and tortured, he doesn't break. The scene also shows Whistler's sacrifice, as he's been turned into a vampire by this point and begs Blade to kill him rather than let him become the monster he spent his life fighting. Blade can't bring himself to do it, which shows his humanity but also creates problems for the future. It's a masterfully tense sequence that strips away all of Blade's weapons and armor, both literal and metaphorical, forcing him to rely on pure willpower to survive. Karen's role in Blade's rescue demonstrates her growth from victim to hero in her own right. After Blade is captured, she could have run, could have tried to go back to her normal life and pretend none of this ever happened. Instead, she chooses to go after him, arming herself with weapons from Whistler's arsenal, despite her limited training and experience with vampire combat. This decision shows real courage. She knows she's probably going to die, but she goes anyway because it's the right thing to do and because Blade saved her life. Her rescue attempt doesn't entirely succeed on its own. She's not suddenly a badass vampire hunter who can take down Frost's entire organization, but she creates enough of a distraction for Blade to break free, and that's what matters. The film doesn't make the mistake of turning Karen into a superhero overnight. Instead, it shows a normal person finding courage in extraordinary circumstances and doing what she can with the skills she has. Her medical knowledge becomes crucial in synthesizing a concentrated serum that can give Blade the strength he needs for the final confrontation, showing that there are multiple ways to contribute to the fight beyond just physical combat. The Lamagra ritual sequence is where the film goes full-on supernatural horror. Frost has gathered 12 pure-blood vampires to serve as living batteries for the ritual, draining their blood along with Blade's to power the transformation. The scene takes place in what appears to be an ancient temple hidden beneath the city, with occult symbols and channels carved into the floor to direct the blood flow. As the ritual progresses, Frost begins transforming into something beyond a normal vampire, his body becoming a vessel for this ancient blood god. The visual effects show his skin becoming translucent, blood flowing beneath the surface, his entire form becoming liquid and reforming. It's genuinely creepy and pushes the film into body horror territory. The 12 purebloods who were supposed to rule alongside Frost as gods instead get consumed as fuel for his transformation, which is a nice bit of poetic justice for these aristocratic vampires who look down on turned vampires like Frost. The ritual chamber looks incredible, combining Gothic architecture with these organic, almost biomechanical elements that make it feel ancient and alien. The final battle between Blade and Frost as Lamagra is appropriately epic. Frost now has insane powers. He can regenerate from any wound, his blood has become weaponized, he's super strong even by vampire standards. The fight takes them through different areas of the temple complex, with Blade using every weapon and technique in his arsenal just to stay alive against this godlike opponent. What makes the fight work is that it's not just a CG spectacle. There's real martial arts choreography mixed in with the supernatural elements, and Wesley Snipes' physicality keeps Blade feeling like a human, well, half-human fighter, even when facing impossible odds. Blade's determination and tactical thinking are what give him the edge. Frost is more powerful, but Blade is smarter and more experienced in actual combat. Karen's role in creating the concentrated serum pays off here, as Blade injects himself with it to temporarily boost his vampire powers to a level where he can compete with Lamagra. The fight climaxes with Blade using Frost's own blood god powers against him, turning the liquid blood that Frost has become into an explosive weapon that destroys him from the inside out. The resolution sees Blade victorious, but at significant cost. Whistler is gone, having asked Blade to kill him to prevent his transformation into a vampire. Blade couldn't do it during the torture scene, leaving Whistler's fate ambiguous in a way that would be addressed in the sequel. Frost and his entire organization are destroyed, and the immediate threat of La Magra is ended. The Vampire Shadow Council is decimated, with most of its members having been sacrificed in Frost's ritual. Karen has the option to return to her normal life now that the threat is over, but there's a sense that she's been changed by these experiences in ways that can't be undone. Blade himself continues his mission, heading off to fight vampires in another city as the cycle begins again. The ending is somewhat bittersweet. The battle is won, but the war continues, and Blade remains fundamentally alone in his mission despite the connections he made during the film. It's an ending that works both as a conclusion to this story and as a potential launching point for further adventures, which is exactly what a good franchise starter should do. The film's impact on the superhero genre cannot be overstated. Before Blade, comic book movies were mostly seen as family-friendly entertainment or campy adventures. Sure, there had been darker attempts like The Crow, but nothing had successfully combined superhero action with horror and martial arts in quite this way. Blade proved that there was an audience for R-rated, serious superhero content that didn't talk down to viewers or soften the material. It showed that a relatively obscure comic book character could carry a major film if the execution was good enough. The movie was a legitimate box office success, earning over $130 million worldwide on a $45 million budget, and it did even better on home video. More importantly, it demonstrated to studios that Marvel properties could be viable film franchises, paving the way for X-Men, Spider-Man, and eventually the entire MCU. Kevin Feige, who would go on to architect the MCU, worked as an associate producer on Blade, and you can see some of the lessons learned here being applied to later Marvel films. The importance of casting, the need to respect the source material while adapting it for cinema, the value of distinctive visual style. Wesley Snipes' performance is absolutely crucial to the film's success and deserves special recognition. Snipes was already an established action star by 1998, having appeared in films like Passenger 57, Demolition Man, and Drop Zone, but Blade took his career to another level. He brings this intensity and physicality to the role that makes Blade feel like a real dangerous person rather than just a comic book character. The martial arts sequences showcase his legitimate fighting skills. Snipes holds a 5th-degree black belt in Shotokan karate and has trained in various other disciplines, and that expertise is evident in every fight scene. He performs most of his own stunts, which gives the action a visceral authenticity that you can feel. Beyond the physical performance, Snipes nails the emotional complexity of the character. Blade could easily have been a one-note badass with no depth, but Snipes finds these moments of vulnerability, humor, and humanity that make him a fully realized character. The way he delivers lines like, "You better wake up, the world you live in is just a sugar-coated topping," or "There are worse things out tonight than vampires," has become iconic, striking the perfect balance between cool and threatening. His chemistry with both Kris Kristofferson and N'Bushe Wright feels genuine, which is essential for the emotional beats to land. Kris Kristofferson as Whistler provides the film with gravitas and emotional weight. Kristofferson was already a legendary figure in music and had done plenty of acting, but Whistler might be one of his most memorable roles. He plays the character as this grizzled, world-weary warrior who's seen too much death and pain, but keeps fighting anyway, because it's all he knows how to do. The relationship between Whistler and Blade feels genuinely paternal, like a father and son who communicate primarily through actions rather than words. Kristofferson has this natural toughness and authenticity that makes you believe Whistler has been hunting vampires for decades. His delivery of lines about vampire physiology and hunting tactics has this matter-of-fact quality that sells the reality of this world. When Whistler talks about garlic being useless or explains how EDTA causes vampire blood to explode, you believe him completely. The scene where he's been turned into a vampire and begs Blade to kill him is heartbreaking, largely because of Kristofferson's performance, the desperation and self-loathing in his voice as he realizes he's become the thing he hates most. Whistler represents the human perspective on this war, and Kristofferson makes you feel the decades of pain and determination that drive him. N'Bushe Wright does excellent work as Karen, despite the character being somewhat underwritten compared to Blade and Whistler. She makes Karen feel like an intelligent, capable professional who's understandably terrified when thrust into this nightmare world, but doesn't let that terror paralyze her. Wright plays the character's arc from frightened victim to active participant with conviction, showing Karen's growing confidence and determination without making it feel unrealistic. The romantic tension between Karen and Blade is handled with subtlety. There's definitely an attraction there, but the film doesn't force it into an explicit romance that would feel out of place given everything else happening. Wright has good chemistry with Snipes, and their scenes together show a different, softer side of Blade that we don't see anywhere else. Karen's medical background is used intelligently throughout the script, rather than being just a throwaway character trait, and Wright sells the technical dialogue convincingly. In a movie filled with alpha male posturing and violence, Karen provides a necessary counterbalance of compassion and reason. Stephen Dorff's Deacon Frost is a villain who's aged really well. In 1998, his performance might have seemed over the top at times, but in retrospect, Dorff was ahead of the curve in playing a comic book villain with theatrical flair while still grounding him in recognizable human motivations. Frost is ambitious, ruthless, and charismatic. You can see why other vampires follow him even when it goes against the established order. Dorff gives him this manic energy, like a cult leader or revolutionary who genuinely believes in his cause and can inspire others to believe in it too. The character could have been a generic, power-hungry villain, but Dorff finds these interesting layers. Frost's resentment at being a turned vampire rather than pureblood, his desire to prove himself superior to those who look down on him, his genuine vision of a world where vampires don't have to hide. The performance is big and theatrical in the best way, appropriate for a character who's essentially staging a vampire revolution. Dorff also handles the physical demands of the role well, holding his own in fight scenes against Wesley Snipes, which is no small feat. When Frost becomes La Magra, Dorff leans into the full monster mode, creating something genuinely unsettling. The supporting cast fills out the world nicely with memorable character turns. Donald Logue as Quinn brings this frat boy energy to a vampire henchman, making him obnoxiously entertaining every time he appears. Quinn's repeated resurrections throughout the film become almost a running gag. Blade kills him in the opening scene, but he keeps coming back because nobody bothered to completely finish him off. Logue plays Quinn as loving the vampire lifestyle, the violence and excess of it all, without any of the pretension of the purebloods or the revolutionary zeal of Frost. He's just having a blood-soaked good time, which makes him fun to watch and satisfying to see destroyed. Udo Kier, as Dragonetti, the leader of the Vampire Shadow Council, brings his trademark European elegance to the role. Kier's been playing sophisticated villains and weirdos for decades, and he uses that experience to create a character who represents old-world vampire aristocracy in just a few scenes. Tracy Lords appears as Raquel, one of Frost's crew, bringing her own brand of edgy credibility to the vampire underground. These supporting roles aren't deeply developed, but each actor brings enough personality that they stick in your memory. The film's approach to vampire mythology is interesting in how it picks and chooses what to include from traditional folklore. Garlic doesn't work. Whistler explicitly states this early on, dismissing it as a useless myth. Crosses and religious symbols have no effect either, which removes any spiritual or religious dimension from the vampire concept and treats them as more of a biological species than supernatural demons. What does work is silver, which is toxic to vampires, and sunlight, which burns them to ash almost instantly. Decapitation works, as does a wooden stake through the heart, though you need to follow up with fire, or they can potentially recover. The film introduces EDTA, a blood anticoagulant, as a weapon that makes vampire blood explode when it enters their system. Vampires need to feed regularly or they start to degenerate, becoming more feral and less human. The turned vampires in this universe retain some of their human personality and memories, though these fade over time. Purebloods are born as vampires and are considered superior, though the film doesn't fully explain how they're born since vampires are traditionally undead. This mix of traditional vampire lore and new inventions creates a mythology that feels both familiar and fresh, respecting the genre while making it their own. The social commentary in Blade is subtle, but definitely present. The vampires in this film are explicitly parasites feeding on human society, living in luxury while humans struggle and die to sustain them. There's a clear metaphor for class warfare and exploitation, with the vampire aristocracy literally feeding on the working class. Frost's rebellion against the pure-blood establishment can be read as revolution against inherited privilege, though the film doesn't endorse his methods or goals since he's the villain. The pure-blood's racism against turned vampires mirrors real-world bigotry based on birth and bloodline. Blade himself exists outside both human and vampire society, rejected by both, which resonates with themes of racial identity and belonging. The film was directed by a white Englishman, but stars a black American actor playing a character who's explicitly other, never fully accepted by either side of his heritage. The movie doesn't beat you over the head with any of this. It's primarily concerned with being an entertaining action horror film. But the subtext is there for viewers who want to engage with it. The urban setting and hip-hop influenced soundtrack also ground the film in contemporary black culture in ways that were unusual for superhero movies at the time. Blade's production had its challenges and difficulties that are well documented now. The budget was relatively modest for an action film at $45 million, which meant the team had to be creative with their resources. Some of the vampire death effects were achieved through clever practical techniques rather than expensive CGI, which actually helped the film age better than it might have otherwise. There were reported conflicts on set between Wesley Snipes and Stephen Norrington, with creative differences about the character and the direction of certain scenes. Snipes, who had significant input on the project and helped develop it for years before filming began, had strong opinions about how Blade should be portrayed, while Norrington, as director, had his own vision. These conflicts occasionally resulted in tension during production, but ultimately, the final film doesn't show any seams from these behind-the-scenes struggles. The movie was shot primarily in Los Angeles, with some sequences filmed in underground locations and warehouses to create the vampire underworld aesthetic. The fight choreography was developed by a team of martial arts experts working closely with Snipes to create combat that showcased his skills while fitting the character. The success of Blade led to 2 sequels that expanded the universe and continued Blade's story. Blade 2, directed by Guillermo del Toro and released in 2004, is often considered the best film in the trilogy, with del Toro bringing his creature design genius to create a new vampire threat that forces Blade to temporarily ally with his enemies. That film brought back Whistler, revealing he survived the first movie and had been held in vampire captivity, which was a satisfying surprise for fans. Blade: Trinity came out in 2004, introducing Ryan Reynolds and Jessica Biel as new vampire hunters and dealing with the Dracula mythology, though it was less well received than the first 2 films. There was also a Blade TV series that ran for 1 season in 2006, with Sticky Fingaz taking over the title role. The character appeared in various animated series as well, becoming part of the larger Marvel Universe in animation. For years, there were rumors of a Blade 4 with Wesley Snipes returning, but these never materialized. In recent years, Marvel Studios announced that Mahershala Ali would be taking over the role for a new MCU version of Blade, acknowledging the character's importance to Marvel's film history while looking to bring him into the current franchise continuity. The film's legacy in terms of representation is significant. Blade was one of the first major superhero films with a black lead character, predating films like Hancock or Black Panther by years. Wesley Snipes' Blade is a character whose blackness isn't incidental or tokenized. It's integral to who he is and how he moves through the world, even if the film doesn't explicitly discuss racial themes. Having a black actor as the unquestioned hero and most competent fighter in the film, surrounded by a racially diverse cast, was meaningful representation at a time when Hollywood action films were still overwhelmingly dominated by white leads. The film's success proved that audiences of all backgrounds would embrace a black superhero, helping to pave the way for more diverse casting in the genre. It's worth noting that the character of Blade was created by writer Marv Wolfman and artist Gene Colan in the 1970s, and was black from his first comic appearance. So the film was respecting the source material, but it was still a somewhat risky choice from a studio perspective in 1998. The fact that it paid off both critically and commercially made it easier for future films to take similar risks with diverse casting. The action choreography deserves deeper analysis because it's really what sets Blade apart from other action films of its era. The fight scenes combine multiple disciplines. You've got traditional martial arts, wire work, gunplay, and sword fighting all blended together into this unique style. Wesley Snipes' legitimate martial arts background allowed the choreographers to create complex, fast-paced sequences that less skilled actors couldn't have pulled off. The fights have this balletic quality at times, with Blade moving fluidly between targets and weapons, but they never lose their sense of impact and danger. Each fight is shot and edited to actually show what's happening rather than hiding the action behind shaky cam and rapid cuts, which was becoming common in action cinema at the time. You can see every move, every strike, which makes the fights more satisfying and showcases Snipes' skills. The weapons work is particularly impressive. The way Blade handles his sword, the smooth draws and holstering of his guns, the throwing of silver stakes, all of it looks practiced and natural rather than clumsy or overly choreographed. The stunt team created increasingly elaborate sequences as the film progresses, building to that final confrontation with Frost where everything comes together. The film's opening sequence is often cited as one of the best opening scenes in action cinema, and for good reason. It's a masterclass in establishing tone, character, and world building in just a few minutes. We start with a human being led into what appears to be a normal nightclub. But once inside, the sprinklers start spraying blood and everyone in the club reveals themselves to be vampires. The human realizes he's been brought as food, and panic sets in just as Blade appears. The scene that follows is a perfectly executed action sequence set to pounding techno music, with Blade systematically destroying vampires while strobe lights flash and blood rains from above. It introduces Blade as this unstoppable force, shows the audience the film's distinctive visual style, establishes the rules of vampire death with the ash effects, and sets up the conflict with Quinn and eventually Frost. All of this happens before the title card appears. It's an opening that grabs you by the throat and doesn't let go, immediately letting you know this isn't your traditional superhero movie. The blood rave has become iconic in its own right, referenced and parodied in countless other works. It's audacious and excessive in the best possible way, making a statement about what kind of film Blade is going to be. The film's costume design by Sanja Milkovich-Hayes is crucial to establishing the look and feel of the characters. Blade's costume has become iconic. The black leather coat, the dark sunglasses, the tactical gear, and weapons harness, all combining to create this intimidating vampire hunter silhouette. The outfit is practical for what Blade does, with pockets and holsters for his various weapons, while also looking undeniably cool. The long coat gives Blade's movements a dramatic flair during fight scenes, flowing and snapping with his martial arts. The sunglasses serve both a practical purpose, protecting his sensitive eyes from the bright lights, and a stylistic one, making Blade's face harder to read and adding to his mystique. The costume has been widely imitated and parodied in the years since, which is always a sign of iconic design. The vampires in the film have their own distinct style. Frost and his crew dress in contemporary club wear, lots of leather and dark colors, fitting their modern sensibility. The pure-blood vampires wear expensive suits and formal wear, looking like wealthy businessmen, which reflects their upper-class status. Each character's costume tells you something about who they are and where they fit in the vampire hierarchy. The film's exploration of Blade's vampire nature and his constant struggle against the thirst is handled with surprising depth for an action movie. We see him inject himself with a serum regularly to suppress his need for blood, essentially an addict managing his addiction through medication. The serum doesn't eliminate the thirst, just keeps it manageable, and we see moments where Blade's control wavers. When he's around fresh blood, you can see the struggle in his face and body language, the way he has to force himself to maintain control. This addiction metaphor adds a layer of tragedy to the character. Blade can never fully escape his vampire nature, he can only manage it, and there's always the possibility that he'll lose control and become the monster he hunts. The film shows how isolating this existence is. Blade can't allow himself to get too close to people because he's afraid of what he might do if his control slips. When Frost offers him the opportunity to embrace his vampire side, to stop fighting it and accept the power it offers, you can see the temptation in Blade's eyes, even though he ultimately rejects it. Wesley Snipes plays these internal conflict moments beautifully, showing us Blade's struggle without excessive dialogue or explanation. Whistler's workshop and arsenal represent this wonderful blend of high-tech weaponry and garage mechanic ingenuity. The space is filled with specialized weapons designed specifically for hunting vampires. UV lamps, silver stakes, explosive rounds, the EDTA injector gun, and various other tools of the trade. Everything looks functional and used rather than shiny and new, giving the sense that Whistler has been refining these designs over decades of vampire hunting. There are workbenches covered in weapon parts, computer screens displaying information about vampire physiology, and these great practical details that make the space feel lived in and real. The film takes time to show us some of these weapons being prepared and loaded, which builds anticipation for when they'll be used in combat. Whistler's workshop represents the human resistance to the vampire threat. It's not magic or supernatural power that fights them. It's human ingenuity, science, and determination. The attention to detail in designing these weapons shows the thought that went into making vampire hunting feel like a legitimate tactical operation rather than just random violence. The film's treatment of vampire senses and abilities is fairly consistent and well-defined. Vampires have enhanced strength, speed, and healing compared to humans. They can see in the dark and have heightened senses of smell and hearing. They're vulnerable to silver, sunlight, and garlic extract in concentrated doses, though not to garlic in its natural form. They cast reflections and can be photographed, contrary to some vampire myths. Decapitation and cardiac destruction kill them permanently, though lesser wounds heal rapidly. Blade has all these vampire abilities, but without most of the weaknesses. He can walk in sunlight, doesn't burn from silver, and has even greater strength and speed than normal vampires due to his hybrid nature. His only vampire weakness is the thirst for blood, which he manages with the serum. This clearly defined set of rules makes the action sequences work better because the audience understands what can and can't hurt the characters. When Blade pulls out silver stakes or UV lights, we know these will be effective. When vampires regenerate from bullet wounds, we know why and aren't confused. This kind of internal consistency in the mythology is important for maintaining suspension of disbelief. The romantic and sexual elements in Blade are present, but never overwhelm the main story. There's definitely attraction between Blade and Karen, shown through glances, physical proximity, and the way they gradually open up to each other emotionally. The film never pushes this into an explicit romance, though. They don't kiss, don't declare their love, don't end up together in any traditional sense. This restraint actually makes their connection feel more authentic, like two people who've been through trauma together and found genuine connection, but don't have the luxury of exploring it fully given the circumstances. The vampire world is shown as having a sexual dimension. Frost's seduction and feeding on victims has an explicitly erotic quality, and the blood rave sequence has this orgiastic energy. The scene where vampire Vanessa tries to seduce Blade is deeply uncomfortable, specifically because it takes this sexual energy and twists it into something wrong and predatory. The film uses sexuality as part of its horror palette, showing the vampires as creatures of appetite and excess, while Blade's rejection of these pleasures is part of his rejection of his vampire nature. One of the film's smartest choices is showing the vampire world's infrastructure and organization. These aren't just random monsters attacking people. They have a whole society with businesses, records, hierarchies, and systems. We see vampire-run blood banks that provide them with safe feeding sources. We see the archive, where they keep records of their history and genealogy. We see their nightclubs and gathering places. We see the political structure of the Shadow Council that governs their society. This level of world-building makes the vampires feel like a credible threat. They're not just hiding in coffins in random basements. They've infiltrated human society at every level and built their own parallel civilization. It also raises the stakes of Frost's revolution, because he's not just trying to kill Blade, he's trying to overthrow an entire social order that's existed for centuries. The glimpses we get of this vampire infrastructure make us believe there's a much larger story happening beyond just what we see in this film, which gives the world depth and makes viewers want to know more. The editing by Paul Rubel keeps the film moving at a brisk pace without feeling rushed or incomprehensible. Action sequences are cut to maximize clarity and impact. We can always tell who's fighting whom and where everyone is in space, which is crucial for good action filmmaking. The film uses quick cuts during intense moments, but knows when to hold on a shot to let us appreciate a particularly cool move or effect. Transitions between scenes are smooth, often using visual or thematic links to move from one location to another without jarring the audience out of the story. The pacing varies appropriately. After big action sequences, the film gives us quieter character moments to catch our breath before building to the next set piece. There's a good rhythm to how information is revealed, how action and story beats are distributed throughout the runtime, that keeps the energy high without exhausting the audience. The final cut runs about 120 minutes, which is a good length for this kind of film, long enough to tell the story properly, but not so long that it overstays its welcome. The film's influence on fashion and pop culture was significant in the late 90s and early 2000s. Blade's leather coat, dark sunglasses, and tactical gear look became hugely popular, inspiring countless Halloween costumes and influencing character designs in other media. The long leather coat, in particular, became associated with action heroes for years after, appearing in The Matrix, Underworld, and numerous other films. The vampire aesthetic, shown in Blade, with its combination of gothic elements and modern club culture, influenced how vampires were portrayed in media for years afterward. The blood rave sequence inspired similar scenes in other films and became a visual shorthand for underground vampire culture. Wesley Snipes' portrayal of Blade as this stoic, badass warrior influenced action hero archetypes across multiple genres. You can see elements of Blade in characters from video games, comics, and films that came after, particularly in how they blend superhero action with horror elements. The film proved there was a market for dark, violent superhero content, which helped greenlight projects with similar tones. Blade's success demonstrated that superhero films didn't need to be based on the most famous comic book characters to work. Before this, studios focused on the biggest names: Superman, Batman, Spider-Man. Blade was a relatively obscure character from Marvel's horror comics, not a household name. Yet the film found a large audience because the execution was strong. This opened the door for films based on lesser-known properties like Iron Man, which eventually became the foundation of the MCU. The lesson was that character name recognition mattered less than good filmmaking, strong casting, and respect for the source material. Studios became more willing to take chances on characters that might not have obvious mainstream appeal if the creative team could make a compelling case for them. This shift in thinking was crucial for the eventual explosion of superhero cinema in the 2000s and 2010s. Without Blade's success proving the viability of non-A-list Marvel characters, the landscape of modern blockbuster filmmaking would likely look very different. The vampire makeup and effects deserve special mention for their effectiveness. When vampires reveal their true faces, their eyes change color, their fangs extend, and their features become more feral and predatory. These transformations are achieved primarily through practical makeup effects, prosthetics, and contact lenses rather than CGI, which gives them a tactile reality that digital effects often lack. The vampire faces are genuinely unsettling, hitting that uncanny valley between human and monster that makes them effective horror creatures. Each vampire's true face is slightly different, suggesting individual variation rather than a one-size-fits-all transformation, which adds to the believability. The fangs in particular look dangerous and functional rather than decorative. When vampires feed, the practical blood effects and the actors' performances combine to create scenes that are both horrifying and weirdly sensual, capturing that traditional vampire duality of predator and seducer. The death effects, where vampires burst into flames and crumble to ash, provide a satisfying, visceral conclusion to fight scenes while also being practical in terms of cleanup. Blade doesn't have to deal with bodies, which keeps the focus on action rather than aftermath. The film's portrayal of Blade's tactical approach to vampire hunting shows intelligence in the action design. Blade doesn't just run into situations wildly. He prepares. He scouts. He brings the right weapons for the job. When he attacks the vampire archive, he comes loaded with UV lights and explosive weapons because he knows he'll be facing multiple vampires in an enclosed space. When he infiltrates Frost's lair, he's careful and methodical, using stealth when possible, and overwhelming firepower when stealth fails. He knows vampire physiology intimately, where to strike for maximum damage, which weapons will be most effective in different situations, how to use the environment to his advantage. This tactical intelligence makes Blade feel like a real hunter rather than just a brawler, and it makes the action sequences more interesting because there's strategy involved, not just random violence. We see him think during fights, adapt to changing circumstances, and use his knowledge of his enemies against them. This cerebral element to the action elevates Blade above typical action heroes who just punch their way through problems. Looking at Blade from a modern perspective, some elements have dated while others have aged remarkably well. The action sequences still hold up beautifully. Good fight choreography and practical stunt work never really age in the way that visual effects can. Wesley Snipes' performance remains compelling, and the character work still resonates. The practical makeup effects and costume design still look great. Some of the dialogue and humor reflect late 90s sensibilities that might seem slightly off to modern viewers, but nothing too cringeworthy. The CGI effects, particularly in the final Lamagra sequence, are definitely dated by today's standards, but they're not so bad that they ruin the experience. The film's treatment of its female characters is a bit limited by today's standards. Karen is a good character, but she's primarily reactive rather than proactive, and the other women in the film are mostly vampire seductresses or victims. The film's depiction of violence and its R rating feel less transgressive now than they did in 1998, simply because we've seen so much more extreme content in the years since. Overall, though, Blade holds up remarkably well for a film that's over 25 years old, which is a testament to the craft that went into making it. The film's structure follows a pretty classic hero's journey arc with some variations. Blade starts in his ordinary world of vampire hunting, gets called to adventure when Karen enters his life, and Frost's plans accelerate. Initially resists changing his isolated approach, crosses the threshold into deeper involvement with Karen and the vampire conspiracy, faces tests and trials, including the revelation about his mother, experiences a dark night of the soul when he's captured and tortured, gains the knowledge and power needed to succeed through Karen's serum, and returns transformed, having accepted both sides of his nature more fully. This archetypal structure works because it's fundamentally satisfying on a narrative level, giving the story shape and meaning beyond just a series of action scenes. The film knows when to follow the template and when to deviate from it. Blade doesn't get a traditional return with the elixir ending where he comes home changed, instead riding off to continue his mission, which fits the character and leaves room for future stories. Blade's relationship with violence is interesting and somewhat complex for an action film. The movie doesn't shy away from showing violence as brutal and consequential. When Blade fights vampires, the destruction is total, with bodies being dismembered, burned, and exploded. At the same time, because the vampires turn to ash when they die, there's a slight distancing effect that makes the violence more palatable for audiences. The film doesn't glorify violence in a simple way. Blade is shown as damaged by his life of combat, isolated and struggling with his darker impulses. The violence is necessary in the context of the story because these are monsters that need to be stopped. But there's also a sense that this life has cost Blade his humanity. in many ways. When he's forced to kill his mother, even though she's become a vampire, it's portrayed as genuinely traumatic rather than just another action beat. The film manages to deliver exciting, visceral action while also acknowledging that violence has psychological and emotional costs, which gives it more depth than pure exploitation. The film's depiction of technology is very much of its late 90s moment, with chunky computers, early internet references, and technology that looks primitive by today's standards, but was cutting edge at the time. Interestingly, this datedness actually works in some ways because it places the film in a specific time period rather than trying to be timeless. The Vampire Archive's combination of ancient books and modern computers creates this interesting aesthetic of old and new colliding. Whistler's Workshop has this jerry-rigged hacker aesthetic with equipment that looks functional rather than sleek and polished. The medical technology Karen uses is realistic for the time period. The vampire scanning technology that identifies humans versus vampires is pure sci-fi, but fits within the film's established rules. None of the technology is so prominently featured that its datedness becomes a problem. It's background detail that supports the story rather than driving it. The film wisely focuses on timeless elements like character, action, and mythology, rather than trying to be a tech showcase. The film's sound design creates an immersive audio experience that enhances the action and horror elements. Each of Blade's weapons has a distinctive sound. The particular whistle of his silver boomerangs, the mechanical click of his gun mechanisms, the sharp, metallic ring of his sword being drawn. Vampire movements often have this subtle whooshing or rustling sound that makes them seem faster and more dangerous than normal humans. The sound of vampires burning in sunlight is this horrible, sizzling, crackling noise that makes you feel the pain of their destruction. Ambient sound in the vampire club scenes creates this oppressive, overwhelming atmosphere with pounding bass and layered music that makes the spaces feel claustrophobic and dangerous. The quieter scenes have careful sound design too. The hum of equipment in Whistler's Workshop, the medical sounds in the hospital, the urban ambiance of the city at night. Good sound design should support the visuals without drawing attention to itself, and Blade achieves this balance, using audio to enhance the experience without overwhelming it. Blade's moral code is interesting because it's not exactly heroic in a traditional sense. He kills vampires without mercy or hesitation, regardless of whether they're actively threatening anyone at that moment. From his perspective, all vampires are monsters who will eventually hurt humans, so eliminating them preemptively is justified. This puts him in a morally gray area. He's essentially executing beings for what they are rather than what they've done, which is ethically problematic. The film doesn't really interrogate this moral ambiguity too deeply, presenting Blade's mission as justified because vampires are indeed dangerous predators. But there are hints of complexity. Blade's mother became a vampire through no choice of her own, and there's a suggestion that some vampires might be able to resist their predatory nature. Blade himself is partially a vampire, which complicates his black and white worldview. His willingness to work with Karen and to spare her when she's bitten suggests his code isn't entirely rigid. The film presents Blade as doing necessary work in an impossible situation, fighting monsters who threaten humanity without making him a spotless hero. He's a weapon pointed at a threat, and weapons don't have to worry about moral nuance. The film's climax brings together all the threads established throughout the story in a satisfying way. Frost's plan to become La Magra requires Blade's blood, which means the final confrontation was inevitable from the moment Frost learned about the Daywalker. Karen's medical expertise pays off with the serum that gives Blade the edge he needs. Whistler's weapons and training are what allow Blade to survive long enough to get to Frost. The information gathered from Pearl about the La Magra ritual becomes crucial to understanding how to stop it. Blade's acceptance of his vampire side, symbolized by his willingness to fully embrace his powers using the serum, represents his character growth. The destruction of the Shadow Council, purebloods in Frost's ritual, resolves that political subplot, while also demonstrating the cost of Frost's ambition. Every major element introduced earlier in the film has a payoff in the final act, which is good screenwriting and makes the story feel complete and purposeful rather than episodic or random. In conclusion, Blade stands as a landmark achievement in superhero cinema and action filmmaking. It took a relatively obscure comic book character and created a compelling film that works on multiple levels. As a superhero origin story, as a horror film, as a martial arts action movie, and as a character study of a man torn between two worlds. Wesley Snipes delivered a star-making performance that defined the character for an entire generation. The supporting cast brought depth and authenticity to their roles. Stephen Norrington's direction created a distinctive visual style that set Blade apart from other films of its era. David S. Goyer's screenplay efficiently established a rich mythology while never losing sight of character or pacing. The action sequences remain exciting and well-crafted decades later. The film proved that R-rated, serious superhero content could find a mainstream audience, paving the way for the entire modern superhero genre. It demonstrated that relatively unknown comic book characters could carry major films if the execution was strong enough. Blade respects its source material while adapting it intelligently for cinema. It takes risks with tone and content that paid off creatively and commercially. The film has its flaws, some dated effects, occasionally thin characterization for supporting players, and narrative choices that don't fully explore some of the moral complexity of its premise. But these are minor issues in what is overall an extremely successful film that achieves what it sets out to do. Blade remains highly watchable and entertaining over 25 years after its release, which is the ultimate test of quality for any film. It's a movie that knows exactly what it wants to be and executes that vision with skill, style, and confidence, creating something that still feels fresh and exciting today. What really sets Blade apart when you dig into it is how the film understands the importance of world building without getting lost in exposition dumps. A lot of movies from this era would stop the action dead to explain everything about their universe through clunky dialogue or voice-over narration. But Blade trusts its audience to pick up on details organically. We learn about vampire society through visual cues and brief conversations rather than some character sitting us down for a history lesson. The vampire glyphs and symbols we see in the archive, the way different vampires dress and carry themselves, the architecture of their gathering places, all of this communicates information about their culture without anyone having to spell it out. This approach keeps the momentum going while still creating a world that feels lived in and real. You get the sense that there are hundreds of stories happening in this universe that we're not seeing, which is the mark of effective world building. The film gives you just enough information to understand what's happening and why it matters, then gets back to the action. What's particularly clever is how the movie uses Karen's introduction to this world as a vehicle for exposition without it feeling forced. She's asking the questions we'd ask, and Blade and Whistler's answers feel natural because they're responding to her genuine confusion and terror. When Whistler explains that garlic is useless or demonstrates how the EDTA rounds work, it's in the context of preparing Karen to defend herself, so the information serves both a narrative purpose and a character purpose. This is way more elegant than having characters explain things they would already know just for the audience's benefit. The script finds these organic moments to drop information, a casual comment here, a demonstration there, that build up our understanding of the rules without ever feeling like we're being lectured to. It's screenwriting 101. But so many movies get this wrong that it's worth highlighting when a film does it right. The pacing of Blade is really something worth appreciating, especially when you compare it to modern superhero films that often sprawl to 2.5 or 3 hours. This movie tells a complete story with character arcs, world building, multiple action sequences, and emotional beats in just 2 hours, and it never feels rushed or incomplete. There's this efficiency to the storytelling where every scene serves multiple purposes, advancing the plot, developing character, establishing setting, or delivering action, and usually doing 2 or 3 of those things simultaneously. The film doesn't waste time on unnecessary subplots or tangents that don't contribute to the main story. Everything we see is relevant to either understanding who Blade is, what he's fighting against, or how he's going to overcome the challenges he faces. This tight narrative focus is part of what makes the film so rewatchable. There's no filler to skip through, no scenes that drag, no moments where you're checking your watch, wondering when we'll get back to the good stuff. Another aspect that deserves recognition is how Blade handles its quieter character moments without letting the energy completely deflate. After intense action sequences, the film gives us these breathing room scenes where characters talk, plan, or deal with the emotional fallout of what's happened. But these scenes are never boring because there's always an undercurrent of tension or urgency. When Blade and Karen are in Whistler's workshop preparing weapons or discussing vampire physiology, there's always the awareness that danger could strike at any moment, that time is running out, that the stakes are real. The film maintains this sense of forward momentum even when people are standing around talking, which is harder to achieve than it sounds. Part of this comes from the performances. The actors bring intensity even to exposition scenes. And part comes from the direction and editing, which keeps things visually interesting even when the action isn't wall-to-wall. The score also helps here, maintaining atmosphere and tension during dialogue-heavy scenes so they don't feel like dead air. The film's use of locations is really smart in creating this sense of a vampire underworld existing parallel to normal society. We see these normal urban spaces, hospitals, nightclubs, warehouses, office buildings, that have been infiltrated or repurposed by vampires for their own use. The blood rave happens in what looks like an ordinary industrial space that's been converted into a nightclub. The archive is hidden beneath the city in what might have once been storage tunnels or subway infrastructure. Frost's penthouse looks like any other luxury apartment from the outside, but inside it's decorated with vampire art and occult symbols. This approach makes the vampire threat feel more immediate and real than if they were all living in Gothic castles in remote locations. The message is clear. Vampires are everywhere, hiding in plain sight, using the same urban infrastructure as normal humans, but for sinister purposes. It's creepy, in a very practical, believable way that Gothic horror locations often aren't. The relationship dynamics in Blade are refreshingly uncomplicated compared to a lot of action films. There's no forced love triangle, no manufactured interpersonal drama, no characters keeping secrets from each other for contrived reasons. Blade, Whistler, and Karen form this functional team where everyone contributes what they can and trusts the others to do their part. Sure, there's romantic tension between Blade and Karen, but it never becomes a distraction from the mission or a source of conflict between characters. When Whistler is captured and turned, Blade's emotional response is shown, but it doesn't paralyze him or lead to him making stupid decisions. He processes it and keeps moving forward because that's who he is. The villains have their own clear hierarchy and relationships that make sense without requiring extensive backstory. Frost wants to overthrow the purebloods. The purebloods want to maintain the status quo, and these conflicting goals drive the plot without needing a bunch of personal betrayals or complicated scheming. The simplicity of these relationship dynamics actually works in the film's favor, keeping the focus on the action and the core conflict rather than getting bogged down in interpersonal melodrama. One thing that's easy to overlook is how well Blade establishes stakes and maintains them throughout the film. From the opening scene, we understand that vampires are a real threat to humanity, that Blade is one of the few people fighting them, and that if he fails, people die. The film keeps reminding us of these stakes without being heavy-handed about it. We see vampires feeding on victims. We see the scope of their infiltration into human society. We see the consequences when Blade isn't there to stop them. When Frost's plan to awaken La Magra is revealed, the stakes escalate from vampires are killing people to vampires might enslave or destroy all of humanity, which gives the final act real urgency. The film earns this escalation by building up to it gradually rather than just dumping it on us in the third act. We learn about La Magra in pieces, first just as a name in the archive, then as an ancient prophecy, then as something Frost is actively working to achieve, then as an imminent threat that Blade has to stop right now. This gradual escalation keeps the tension building throughout the runtime. The humor in Blade is pretty sparse, but when it lands perfectly. This isn't a quip fest where characters are constantly undercutting dramatic moments with jokes. The tone is primarily serious and intense, but there are these moments of dark humor that provide relief without destroying the atmosphere. Whistler's dry comments about vampire behavior, Blade's deadpan responses to absurd situations, the almost slapstick quality of Quinn's repeated resurrections. These moments give us permission to enjoy the ride without feeling guilty about the violence we're watching. The "some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill" line has become legendary precisely because it comes out of nowhere, makes no literal sense, but perfectly captures Blade's assessment of Frost's doomed ambitions. It's weird and specific and absolutely confident in its delivery, which makes it memorable. The film's humor is very much of the cool badass says cool badass things variety. That was popular in the 90s, but it's used sparingly enough that it doesn't become tiresome. Looking at the film's influence on action cinematography, you can see Blade's fingerprints all over action movies that came after it, particularly in how it shoots fight scenes. The use of wide shots that let you see the full choreography, the strategic use of slow motion to highlight particularly impressive moves, the combination of practical stunts and subtle wire work to enhance but not replace human performance. These techniques became standard in action filmmaking after Blade proved how effective they could be. The Matrix, which came out a year later, took some of these ideas and pushed them even further with its bullet-time photography and more elaborate wire work. But Blade was there first, showing how to blend martial arts with gunplay in a way that felt fresh and exciting. The John Wick films owe a debt to Blade in their approach to gun-fu action, where firearms are used almost like martial arts weapons in close-quarters combat. The way Blade moves through spaces clearing enemies with a combination of sword, guns, and hand-to-hand combat prefigures a lot of what we see in modern action filmmaking. The film's approach to explaining Blade's powers and limitations is handled really well through showing rather than telling. We see the serum injection ritual early on, which establishes that Blade needs this treatment regularly to control his thirst. We see him fighting in full sunlight, which demonstrates his Daywalker ability without anyone having to say, unlike normal vampires, Blade can walk in sunlight. We see his enhanced strength and speed and action, making it clear he's superhuman without needing a scene where someone measures his abilities scientifically. The one vampire weakness he does have, the bloodthirst, is shown as a constant struggle rather than just mentioned once and forgotten. There are multiple scenes where Blade is around blood and has to fight his instincts, showing us that this is an ongoing battle, not a solved problem. This restraint in how powers are explained makes the fantastical elements feel more grounded and believable, because we're discovering Blade's abilities alongside Karen rather than having them cataloged for us in an info dump. What's interesting about the film's depiction of vampire society is how it mirrors and critiques real-world power structures. The pure-blood vampires are essentially an aristocracy that derives their status from birth rather than achievement, and they use this inherited privilege to maintain power over the turned vampires who actually did something to become what they are. Frost, despite being turned rather than born, has more drive and ambition than any of the purebloods, but he's still treated as inferior because of circumstances beyond his control. This class conflict within vampire society adds depth to what could have been a simple good versus evil story. Frost isn't wrong that the pureblood system is corrupt and unjust. He's just responding to that injustice by trying to become an even worse tyrant himself. The film doesn't make a big deal out of this social commentary, but it's there for viewers who want to engage with it, adding another layer to the story without getting preachy or heavy-handed about it. The practical versus digital effects balance in Blade is really instructive for filmmakers today who have access to unlimited CGI, but don't always use it wisely. Blade uses digital effects where they make sense, enhancing the vampire death scenes, creating some of the more supernatural elements of the La Magra transformation, but relies primarily on practical effects, real stunts, and actual locations to create its world. This gives the film a tactile quality that fully CGI environments can't match. When Blade is fighting vampires, those are real stunt performers getting thrown around, real hits connecting, safely obviously, real physical presence and weight to the action. When we see Whistler's workshop full of weapons, those are real props that the actors can actually handle and interact with. This physicality grounds the fantastical elements in a reality that makes them more impactful. The few moments where the CGI is obviously dated don't ruin the experience because they're brief and surrounded by practical effects that still look great. It's a lesson modern blockbusters could stand to learn. Sometimes the old-fashioned way of doing things actually works better than the cutting-edge technology. The editing rhythm during action sequences shows a real understanding of how to build excitement and maintain clarity simultaneously. The cuts are quick enough to convey speed and intensity, but not so rapid that you can't tell what's happening. Every action has a setup and a payoff that the camera captures clearly. When Blade throws a boomerang, we see him throw it, see it flying through the air, see it hit its target, and see the result. When he's fighting hand to hand, the shots are framed and cut so we can appreciate the choreography and understand the geography of the fight. There's none of this shaky cam nonsense where incomprehensible action is disguised as kinetic energy. The film trusts that the stunt work and choreography are good enough to showcase clearly, and that trust is well placed. Modern action movies have gotten so used to hiding mediocre action behind rapid cuts and camera shake that it's refreshing to go back to Blade and see every punch, kick, and sword strike presented clearly for the audience to appreciate. The way Blade handles exposition about vampire weaknesses is pretty elegant when you break it down. Instead of having one big scene where someone explains all the rules, we learn about different vulnerabilities as they become relevant to the plot. We learn Silva is toxic to vampires when Blade uses silver stakes in the opening fight. We learn about EDTA when Whistler is loading bullets and mentions it casually. We learn about sunlight's deadly effects when we see a vampire accidentally exposed to it. We learn about the serum that controls Blade's thirst when we see him injecting it. Each piece of information is introduced exactly when we need it to understand what's happening in the current scene, which keeps the pace moving while still building our understanding of the rules. This is much more effective than front-loading all the exposition in the first act, because it means we're constantly learning new things throughout the film rather than having to remember everything we were told in the first 20 minutes. The design of the vampire true faces deserves more credit than it sometimes gets. These aren't just humans with fangs. The entire face changes, becoming more animalistic and predatory with altered bone structure, different eyes, extended jaws to accommodate the fangs, and changed skin texture. It's a transformation that makes vampires genuinely scary, rather than just sexy people with dental work. The design strikes this balance between being monstrous enough to be frightening, but human enough that we can still recognize the person underneath, which is important for scenes where characters we know are revealed to be vampires. The practical makeup effects used to achieve these transformations give them weight and presence that CGI faces often lack. These are physical objects that interact with light and shadow in realistic ways, that move and deform naturally when the actors speak or snarl. The contact lenses that change the eye color add to the alienness without overwhelming the practical makeup work. It's a holistic design that considers how all the elements work together to create something that's both horrific and believable within the film's reality. When you look at how Blade influenced the business side of superhero filmmaking, the impact is significant. The film proved that R-rated superhero content could be commercially successful, which gave studios confidence to greenlight other, darker, more violent comic book adaptations. It showed that faithful adaptation of source material tone was more important than making everything family-friendly to maximize audience. The success of Blade on a modest budget demonstrated that you didn't need $200 million to make an effective superhero film. Good character work, strong action choreography, and a clear creative vision could overcome budget limitations. This opened doors for mid-budget superhero projects that might not have gotten made otherwise. The film also proved the value of having people involved who genuinely understood and respected the source material. Wesley Snipes had been trying to get a Blade movie made for years because he loved the character, and that passion shows in the final product. Studios learned that hiring people who cared about getting it right was more valuable than just hiring whoever was available. The sound mixing and design during fight scenes does a lot of work that's easy to take for granted. Every weapon has its own distinct audio signature. The whistle of thrown blades, the specific report of different firearms, the particular sound of silver boomerangs cutting through air, the metallic ring of Blade's sword. These audio cues help us track what's happening in complex fight scenes, even when things are moving too fast to fully process visually. The impact sounds, when hits connect, have real weight to them, selling the power behind Blade's attacks. The sounds of vampires dying, the whoosh of ignition, the crackling of burning flesh, the final dissipation into ash are satisfying and definitive, giving each kill a sense of finality. Even in quieter scenes, the sound design is working to build atmosphere, the hum and beep of equipment in Whistler's workshop, the ambient sounds of the city at night, the unsettling silence in the vampire archive. Good sound design is invisible when it's working, but Blade's action would be significantly less impactful without the careful attention paid to every audio element. The film's color grading and lighting create this really distinctive look that helps differentiate the human world from the vampire world. Scenes in normal human spaces, the hospital where Karen works, the streets during daytime, have more natural lighting and color. Vampire spaces are heavily color-graded with emphasis on reds, blues, and deep shadows, creating this heightened, almost expressionistic look that signals we're in dangerous territory. The blood rave scene is an explosion of red light and strobe effects that's almost overwhelming, which perfectly captures the excess and danger of vampire culture. Whistler's workshop has this cool blue-white light from fluorescent tubes and computer screens that makes it feel clinical and focused, a place of science and preparation rather than indulgence. When Blade moves between these different spaces, the lighting and color schemes help us understand where we are in the story and what the mood should be, without anyone having to say it. It's visual storytelling through cinematography and color grading that reinforces the narrative and thematic elements. The way Blade handles its origin story is refreshingly brisk compared to modern superhero films that spend half their runtime on how the character got their powers. We get Blade's origin in a quick flashback. His mother was attacked while pregnant. He was born with these hybrid abilities. Whistler found and trained him, and that's all we need. The movie doesn't dwell on Blade's childhood or spend 45 minutes showing his training montage. We meet him as an already established vampire hunter and learn about his past through brief flashbacks and dialogue as needed. This economy of storytelling gets us into the actual plot much faster while still giving us enough backstory to understand who Blade is and what motivates him. The revelation about his mother being alive comes later as a dramatic twist rather than being part of the initial origin story, which is a smart structural choice that keeps surprises in reserve for the second and third acts. Modern superhero films could learn from this. Not every origin story needs to be told in exhaustive detail. Sometimes a quick sketch is more than enough. Looking at the stunts and choreography in detail, you can really appreciate the craftsmanship involved. These fight scenes were designed by people who understood martial arts and film language, who knew how to create sequences that looked cool, but also told a story. Each fight has its own character and purpose beyond just, here's some action to wake up the audience. The opening blood rave fight establishes Blade as an unstoppable force and introduces his fighting style. The subway fight with Quinn shows Blade's adaptability when he's separated from his usual arsenal. The archive interrogation of Pearl shows his willingness to use intimidation and torture when needed. The final battle against La Magra forces Blade to dig deeper than ever before and accept his vampire nature more fully. The choreography in each fight supports these narrative and character purposes while also being visually exciting and technically impressive. Wesley Snipes' martial arts background allowed the team to create more complex and ambitious choreography than they could have with a less skilled actor. And his willingness to do his own stunts meant they could get long takes of fight sequences without having to cut around a stunt double. The way the film uses darkness and shadow without making everything visually incomprehensible is actually pretty impressive. A lot of movies set primarily at night end up so dark that you can't see what's happening, but Blade manages to be atmospherically dark while keeping the action visible and clear. This comes down to lighting design, using practicals like neon signs, fires, car headlights, and muzzle flashes to illuminate scenes while maintaining the nighttime atmosphere. The cinematographer understands that darkness is most effective when contrasted with light. So there are always light sources in frame, creating pools of visibility within the darkness. Blade himself is often backlit or caught in dramatic lighting that makes him stand out from the background, ensuring we can always track him through dark environments. The color grading helps too. Those deep blues and reds create visual interest and separation between elements, even when overall light levels are low. It's technically sophisticated lighting and cinematography that achieves a difficult balance between atmospheric darkness and visual clarity. What makes Blade's weaponry so satisfying is the variety and specificity of tools he uses for different situations. He's not just relying on one superweapon to solve every problem. He's got an entire arsenal where each tool serves a specific tactical purpose. Silver stakes for close quarters kills, EDTA bullets for medium range, UV flash grenades for crowd control, the sword for when things get personal, the boomerangs for ranged precision strikes, and the shotgun for when he needs maximum destruction right now. Watching Blade select and deploy the right weapon for each situation is part of the fun. He's not just a brawler, he's a tactician who understands his tools and uses them strategically. The film takes time to show us these weapons being loaded, maintained, and prepared, which builds anticipation for when they'll be used. When Blade finally unleashes a weapon we've seen him carefully preparing earlier, there's a satisfaction to that payoff that makes the action more engaging than if he just pulled random weapons out of nowhere. The score by Mark Isham deserves recognition for how it supports the film without overwhelming it. This isn't a superhero movie with a bombastic, instantly recognizable theme that plays every time the hero appears. It's more subtle and atmospheric than that. The music knows when to step back and let the action or dialogue carry the scene, and when to step forward to enhance the emotional or atmospheric impact. The electronic industrial elements in the score give it a contemporary edge that fits the urban vampire setting, while occasional orchestral elements add drama and weight to key moments. The score works with the licensed soundtrack tracks rather than fighting against them, creating a cohesive sonic identity for the film that blends composed music with curated songs. During action scenes, the music adds energy and rhythm without becoming distracting or drowning out the sound effects. During character moments, it provides emotional subtext without being manipulative or overly sentimental. It's a professional, effective score that serves the film's needs perfectly, even if it's not the most memorable or distinctive superhero music ever written. The film's approach to building Frost as a credible threat is gradual and effective. We first see him as just another vampire in the opening flashback to Blade's birth. Then we meet him in the present as he's building his power base and recruiting followers. We see him defy the Shadow Council and get away with it, establishing that he's powerful and bold enough to challenge the vampire establishment. We see him capture and turn Whistler, proving he can strike at Blade's inner circle. We see him use Blade's mother against him, showing his willingness to fight psychologically dirty. We see him sacrifice 12 ancient purebloods to achieve his goal, demonstrating the scope of his ambition and ruthlessness. By the time he becomes La Magra, we've seen enough of his capabilities and determination that his transformation into a godlike being feels like a natural escalation rather than coming out of nowhere. This gradual building of the villain's threat level keeps the stakes rising throughout the film and makes the final confrontation feel properly earned and climactic. So here we are, thousands of words deep into Blade, and honestly, we could probably go even deeper because there's so much craft and thought packed into this film that it's easy to overlook on a casual view. But I think the key takeaway here is that Blade succeeded because everyone involved understood what they were making and committed to it fully. This wasn't a cynical cash grab or a half-hearted attempt to capitalize on a comic book property. This was a genuine effort to bring a specific character and world to life in a way that respected the source material while making it work for cinema. Wesley Snipes' passion for the project shows in every frame. The stunt team's expertise shows in every fight. The practical effects team's craftsmanship shows in every vampire transformation and death scene. The cinematographer's skill shows in every beautifully composed and lit shot. The editor's rhythm shows in the pacing that keeps you engaged for 2 hours without dead spots. All these elements came together in a way that's increasingly rare in modern blockbuster filmmaking, where individual vision often gets diluted by committee decisions and excessive studio interference. Blade feels like a film that knew exactly what it wanted to be and had the conviction to pursue that vision without compromise, which is why it still works so well over 2 decades later, while other superhero films from the same era feel hopelessly dated. In modern blockbuster filmmaking, where individual vision often gets diluted by committee decisions and excessive studio interference, Blade feels like a film that knew exactly what it wanted to be and had the conviction to pursue that vision without compromise, which is why it still works so well over 2 decades later, while other superhero films from the same era feel hopelessly dated.